The white roses adorning the church pews seemed to mock me as I stood there in my wedding dress, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The string quartet's melody faded into an awful silence as Marcus, my husband-to-be, cleared, his throat to speak the words that would shatter my world. "I can't do this," he announced, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling of St. Michael's Cathedral. "I'm sorry, Claire, but I can't marry you." 200 guests collectively gasped. I felt their stares burning into my back as I stood, frozen at the altar, my perfectly manicured fingers clutching my bouquet so tightly the stems began to crack. But it wasn't just the public humiliation that made my blood run cold. It was the slight smirk I caught playing at the corner of Marcus's lips, barely visible to anyone but me. He was enjoying this. My mother's quiet sob from the front pew barely registered. All I could focus on was the slight tremor in my hands and the USB drive pressing against my ribcage, tucked securely into the bodice of my designer wedding gown. That small device contained everything, every secret, every lie, every piece of evidence I'd gathered over the past 3 months. I'd planned to destroy it after the ceremony, to bury the truth along with my doubts and start fresh with the man I loved. How naive I'd been. "You see," Marcus continued, his voice taking on that smooth, practiced tone he used in the courtroom. "I've realized something important." He turned to address our guests, ever the skillful prosecutor playing to his jury. "I've realized that I cannot build a life on lies." The irony of his statement almost made me laugh. If anyone was an expert on building a life on lies, it was Marcus James Wheeler, rising star of the district attorney's office. The man who'd swept me off my feet at a charity gala 18 months ago. The man whose darkest secrets were currently pressed against my heart, waiting to be revealed. "Claire," he said, turning back to me with perfectly feigned regret. "You're not the person I thought you were." That's when I saw them. Jessica Bradley and her mother in the third row wearing matching expressions of smug satisfaction. Jessica, Marcus's paralegal, who'd been watching me with barely concealed contempt at every wedding planning meeting. Now I understood why. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. This wasn't just a last-minute change of heart. This was orchestrated, planned. A public execution of my reputation? I should have seen it coming. The late nights at the office, the mysterious phone calls, the way he'd insisted on a huge wedding despite my preference for a smaller ceremony. He'd wanted an audience. And here they were, watching my humiliation with a mix of horror and fascination. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake. He assumed I was just another naive client advisor at Morgan Stanley, too trusting and too in love to see through his facade. He didn't know about the anonymous email I'd received 3 months ago, or the private investigator I'd hired, or the digital paper trail I'd uncovered. He had no idea that his perfect plan to humiliate me would backfire in spectacular fashion. "I think," I said, speaking for the first time since his announcement, my voice steadier than I'd expected, "that everyone here deserves to know the truth." My fingers moved to the hidden zipper in my bodice where the USB drive lay waiting. Marcus's confidence wavered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face as he registered my calm demeanor. He'd expected tears, hysteria, perhaps a dramatic exit. Instead, he found himself facing something entirely different, a woman who'd learned to play his game. The string quartet shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My father, a retired judge, leaned forward in his pew, his expression shifting from devastation to curiosity. He, better than anyone, knew the tone of someone about to present evidence in a case. "The truth?" Marcus asked, that familiar, arrogant smile returning. "By all means, Claire, tell us your truth." I met his gaze steadily, feeling the weight of 200 guests holding their breath. In that moment, I thought about all the nights I'd spent piecing together his deception, all the tears I'd shed when I'd first discovered what he really was. But now, standing before him in a wedding dress that cost more than a car, I felt nothing but a cold, calculated clarity. "Oh, I will," I replied, reaching for the zipper. "But I should warn you, Marcus. This truth comes with evidence." The USB drive slid free with a quiet click that seemed to echo through the stunned silence of the cathedral. I could see Marcus's best man, David, shifting nervously behind him. David knew something. His darting eyes and sweating brow confirmed what my investigation had already revealed about his role in all this. "Before you continue with whatever performance you're planning," Marcus interrupted, his prosecutor's instincts kicking in, "remember that there are children present." His eyes flicked meaningfully toward his young nieces in the front row. I smiled, appreciating his attempt to derail me. "How considerate of you to think of the children now, Marcus. Was that same consideration on your mind 3 weeks ago at the Riverside Hotel?" The color drained from Jessica's face. Her mother's smug expression faltered. "I've spent the last 3 months piecing together a fascinating story," I continued, walking toward the pulpit where Father Matthew stood awkwardly, clearly unsure whether to intervene. "It started with an anonymous email, just 4 words. 'He's not worth it.'" My heels clicked against the marble floor as I reached for the ancient laptop the church used for hymn displays. Marcus took a half-step forward, then stopped as my father stood up, his judge's authority still commanding respect even in retirement. "That email led me to hire someone, let's call her Sarah, who specializes in digital forensics. Sarah discovered some interesting transactions in your private accounts, Marcus. Like the shell company you created 6 months ago, Wheeler Consulting LLC?" A murmur rippled through the congregation. Marcus forced a laugh. "My private business dealings hardly seem relevant to this moment, Claire. You're only embarrassing yourself. Further." "Wheeler Consulting," I continued, connecting the USB drive to the laptop, "which received regular payments from 5 different pharmaceutical companies currently under investigation by your office. Companies whose cases mysteriously kept getting delayed or dismissed due to insufficient evidence. The first document appeared on the church's presentation screen: bank statements, transaction records, emails. I'd arranged them meticulously, building my case just as Marcus had taught me during our late-night discussions about his prosecution strategies. "Claire," he warned, his voice dropping to that dangerous tone I'd only heard once before, during a phone call he didn't know I'd recorded. "But that was just the beginning," I said, clicking through to the next set of documents. "The real story started when Sarah traced the ownership of another company, Bradley Strategic Solutions, registered to one Jessica Bradley's mother." Jessica jumped to her feet, but her mother pulled her back down, whispering furiously. "A company that's been receiving monthly payments from Wheeler Consulting, starting exactly 1 week after Marcus and I announced our engagement. Payments that match, to the dollar, the cost of this entire wedding." The congregation erupted in whispers. Marcus's sister clutched her daughters closer, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror. "You see," I said, my voice carrying over the growing murmur, "Marcus never intended to marry me. This wedding, this entire relationship, was an elaborate cover. While he played the role of devoted fiancé, he was using Wheeler Consulting to funnel bribes through Jessica's mother's company, splitting the profits from his corrupted cases." Marcus's practiced composure finally cracked. "These are baseless accusations from a woman who clearly can't handle rejection. None of this so-called evidence would be admissible in court." "Perhaps not," I agreed, clicking to the next document. "But I'm sure the FBI agents present today will find it quite useful for their ongoing investigation. Isn't that right, Agent Torres?" Right on cue, a man in the back pew stood up, followed by 3 others scattered throughout the congregation. Marcus's head snapped around, his eyes wild as he recognized the federal agents who'd been posing as distant family friends. "This isn't the end of the story, Marcus," I said softly, my finger hovering over the keyboard. "This is just the beginning. Would you like to hear what else is on this drive?" Marcus lunged for the laptop, but Agent Torres was faster. Two other agents converged on the altar, creating a barrier between us. The string quartet, sensing the shift in atmosphere, quietly packed their instruments and slipped toward the side. "Exit." "Agent Torres," Marcus said, his voice regaining its smooth confidence. "I hope you realize that any evidence obtained without proper warrants was handed over voluntarily by a concerned citizen," Torres finished, producing his badge. "Miss Anderson has been working with our corruption task force for the past 6 weeks. I savored the flash of betrayal in Marcus's eyes. All those nights I'd listened sympathetically to his work stories, asking innocent questions about his cases, playing the role of supportive fiancé while recording every word. But the pharmaceutical cases are just one thread of this story," I continued, pulling up the next set of files. "Tell me, Marcus, does the name Elena Vasquez mean anything to you?" His face remained impassive, but his left hand twitched. A tell I'd learned to recognize during our Sunday poker nights with his law school friends. "Elena was a key witness in the Santos cartel case," I explained to the stunned congregation. "Her testimony would have implicated dozens of high-ranking members. But tragically, she vanished the night before she was scheduled to appear in court. The case collapsed, and Marcus's office had to drop all charges." A photo appeared on the screen. Marcus shaking hands with Robert Santos, the cartel's alleged accountant, outside a private airport in Mexico. This photo was taken 2 days after Elena disappeared. The metadata shows it was captured on Jessica's phone. She really should have deleted it more thoroughly. I glanced at Jessica, who had gone completely pale. But then again, sharing incriminating evidence with a lover is rarely a wise decision. Marcus's mother let out a choked sob. His father, a retired police chief, stood up and walked out of the church, his shoulders rigid with shame. "Elena is alive, by the way," I added, clicking to the next document. "Living quite comfortably in Argentina, under an assumed name, her new life funded by regular wire transfers from, you guessed it, Wheeler Consulting LLC. David, Marcus's best man, suddenly bolted for the door. He didn't make it 3 steps before another FBI agent intercepted him. "Stay where you are, Mr. Peterson," Agent Torres called out. "We'll want to discuss your role in arranging Ms. Vasquez's transportation." I turned back to Marcus, whose arrogant facade had crumbled into something uglier. "You know what I found most interesting? The timing. You started dating me exactly 1 week after Elena disappeared. After all, what better cover for a corrupt prosecutor than a picture-perfect relationship with a seemingly naive financial advisor?" "You were perfect," Marcus spat, finally dropping his polished mask. "Your father's reputation as an incorruptible judge, your mother's social connections, your own spotless career, dating you made me untouchable. No one would suspect." He trailed off, realizing too late what he'd admitted in front of 200 witnesses. "No one would suspect you were taking bribes?" I finished for him. "Or no one would suspect you were protecting cartel members." "Please, finish that thought. Agent Torres is very interested." The cathedral doors burst open as more FBI agents entered, accompanied by members of the press who'd been quietly tipped off about a major corruption bust at St. Michael's. "But wait," I said, turning back to the laptop. "We haven't even gotten to the offshore accounts yet. Or should we discuss the evidence you planted in the Martinez case first? You remember that case, don't you, Marcus? The one that earned you your promotion to lead prosecutor?" A camera flashed from the back of the church. Marcus's carefully constructed world was crumbling in front of the very audience he'd gathered to witness my humiliation. "What do you want?" he hissed, quiet enough that only I could hear. I leaned closer, my voice equally low. "I want exactly what you planned for me. A very public destruction of everything you hold dear. And we're only halfway through my evidence." The laptop screen flickered to a new set of documents, text messages, surveillance photos, and bank statements. Each piece meticulously organized, each revelation carefully timed for maximum impact. just like Marcus had taught me during our late-night strategy sessions. Let's talk about the Martinez case, I continued, my voice carrying through the now silent cathedral. The one that made your career. A perfect conviction. Evidence found exactly where you said it would be. Witness. Testimonies aligning perfectly with your theory. Jessica shifted in her seat, her fingers drumming nervously against her purse. She knew what was coming. Too perfectly, as it turns out, I said, pulling up a series of text messages. These conversations between Marcus and Officer Reed, who's also here today, by the way, show exactly how that evidence found its way into Miguel Martinez's garage. Officer Reed, seated near the back, made a move to stand but froze as an FBI agent appeared beside him. Miguel Martinez has spent 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, I announced, my voice hardening. His wife died while he was incarcerated. His children were put into foster care. Also, you could secure a high-profile conviction and fast-track your career. The screen displayed a photograph. Marcus and Officer Reed in a dimly lit parking garage exchanging an envelope. The timestamp matched the night before the Martinez raid. But you didn't just destroy Miguel's life, I continued, clicking through more evidence. You used his case to destroy 2 other prosecutors who were competing with you for the lead prosecutor position. Remember Karen Chen and James Morris? Marcus's jaw clenched at the names of his former colleagues. You planted evidence, suggesting they were compromised by the drug cartel. Anonymous tips, fabricated bank transfers, staged photographs, all leading internal affairs to investigate them instead of you. They lost their jobs, their reputations, their marriages. Karen Chen, it turned out, had committed suicide 6 months after her dismissal. Her teenage daughter, seated in the back of the church as Jessica's cousin's date, stood up shakily, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know, Jessica whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Marcus, you told me they were actually corrupt. Shut up, Marcus hissed. But it was too late. Agent Torres, I said calmly, I believe Ms. Bradley is ready to cooperate with your investigation. After all, accessory to evidence tampering carries a significantly lighter sentence than the primary charges. Jessica nodded frantically, ignoring Marcus's glare. While we're on the subject of cooperation, I added, David might want to explain the contents of his safety deposit box at First National Bank. The one containing records of every bribe, every planted evidence, every witness intimidation. Insurance, he called it, in case Marcus ever tried to double-cross him. David's face went from red to white. Marcus whirled to face his best man, his expression murderous. You kept records? He snarled. I learned from the best, David shot back. Just like you taught Claire to document everything. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Marcus's own teachings, his meticulous attention to detail, his insistence on keeping records, all of it now being used to destroy him. My mother had stopped crying, her initial shock giving way to cold anger as she realized the full scope of Marcus's deception. My father was taking notes, his judge's instincts kicking in as he documented each revelation. Your own cases provided the blueprint, I told Marcus. Every time you walked me through a prosecution strategy, every time you bragged about how you built evidence chains, every time you explained how to create an airtight case, I was learning how to expose you. The cathedral's ancient heating system hummed to life, a low drone underlying the tension. Outside, more media vans were arriving, their satellite dishes visible through the stained glass windows. But we haven't even touched on your most recent case yet, I said, turning back to the laptop. The one that would have made national headlines. The one involving the governor's son. Should we discuss what really happened the night of the campus assault? Marcus's eyes widened in genuine fear for the first time. He knew exactly what evidence came next. A series of surveillance photos appeared on the screen. The governor's son, Andrew Preston, stumbling out of a campus bar. The same young man following a female student into a dark parking lot. Then time-stamped security footage from the university's cameras, showing a completely different sequence of events than what had been presented in court. The official story was compelling, I said, my voice steady. A star athlete wrongly accused by a troubled student. His father, our beloved governor, standing by his son as your office systematically discredited the victim's testimony. The charges were dropped last week, weren't they, Marcus? The collection of evidence expanded, bank statements showing a $2 million transfer to Wheeler Consulting from a Cayman Islands account linked to the governor's family, email exchanges between Marcus and the governor's chief of staff, discussing handling the situation. A recorded phone call where Marcus coached the key witness on his testimony. Sarah Parker, I announced, my voice carrying to the rafters. The victim whose life you destroyed to protect the governor's son. A straight-A student with a full scholarship, working 2 jobs to help her younger siblings. She lost everything after your office painted her as an unstable attention seeker. Young woman stood up from the middle pews. Sarah Parker herself, her presence carefully planned for this moment. The governor's wife, who had been seated near the front as a family friend, let out an audible gasp. "Hello, Mrs. Preston," Sarah said, her voice trembling but determined. "Your son didn't just assault me. He'd done it before. And Marcus helped. Cover up every single case." The screen filled with police reports. 3 previous assault allegations against Andrew Preston, all mysteriously buried before reaching court. Each victim's statement matched Sarah's in horrifying detail. The $2 million wasn't just for making this case disappear, I continued, watching Marcus's remaining composure crumble. It was payment for years of protecting Andrew. 4 victims, Marcus. 4 young women whose lives were shattered while you built your perfect career. Agent Torres stepped forward, phone in hand. The governor has just been informed of these developments. He's choosing to cooperate fully with our investigation rather than face additional charges. Marcus laughed, a harsh, broken sound that echoed through the cathedral. You think the governor will let himself go down? He'll bury all of you? His reach goes further than you can imagine. Actually, I replied, clicking to the next document, the governor's reach is precisely what Sarah's legal team was counting on. Every attempt to intimidate witnesses, every offshore transaction, every call to friendly judges, it's all documented. The FBI has been building this case for months. I just provided the final pieces they needed. The magnitude of his downfall finally seemed to hit Marcus. His carefully constructed world of power and corruption was collapsing, each revelation, another crack in his facade. Why? He demanded, turning to me with wild eyes. Why go through with this charade? Why not just turn over the evidence? Because you needed to feel what your victims felt, I answered softly. The helplessness, the public humiliation, the moment when everything you built crumbles in front of the people whose approval you craved the most. From the back of the church came the sound of camera shutters and hurried whispers as reporters documented every moment. Marcus's shame wouldn't just be private, it would be tomorrow's headlines. But we're not finished, I said, turning back to the laptop. The governor's son was just one thread in a much larger tapestry. Should we discuss the evidence you buried in the Kingston pharmaceutical trial? The one where hundreds of patients died from tainted medications? The CEO of Kingston Pharmaceuticals, who had been watching the proceedings with growing horror from the 4th row, suddenly clutched his chest. As ushers rushed to help him, I saw Marcus's eyes dart to the church's side exit. Don't even think about it, Agent Torres warned, noting his desperation. Every exit is covered, and we haven't even gotten to the human trafficking evidence yet. The screen shifted to a new set of evidence. Shipping manifests, doctored immigration papers, and surveillance photos from Port Authority cameras. Each image told part of a story that made the pharmaceutical corruption seem almost benign in comparison. The Port Authority investigation last year, I began, watching recognition dawn on several faces in the congregation. 37 women rescued from shipping containers. Marcus's office handled the prosecution, But somehow only low-level operators were charged. The kingpins mysteriously escaped justice. Marcus's sister abruptly stood up, her face ashen. As a Port Authority supervisor, she'd been the one who first reported the suspicious containers. "Your own sister brought you the case, Marcus," I said, my voice hardening. "She trusted you to bring the real criminals to justice. Instead, you took their money and buried the evidence that would have exposed the entire operation." The laptop displayed offshore transfers, millions flowing through a maze of shell companies before landing in accounts connected to Wheeler Consulting. Each transaction corresponded with key dates in the trafficking investigation. "Julia," Marcus pleaded, turning to his sister. "I can explain." "I gave you names," Julia cut him off, her voice shaking. "I gave you proof. Those women trusted me when I promised them protection. Some of them disappeared after the trial. Did you tell them where to find them?" The heavy cathedral doors opened again as more federal agents entered, accompanied by representatives from Human Trafficking Task Force. Among them was a face I knew Marcus would recognize: Maria Suarez, the key witness who'd recanted her testimony after her family in Mexico received mysterious threats. "Maria didn't just survive," I announced. "She documented everything. The threats, the bribes, the names of every official you helped corrupt. She was building her own case, Marcus. Long before I found her." Maria stepped forward, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to Marcus's crumbling composure. "I learned American law," she said, her accented voice carrying clearly. "While hiding from your friends, I studied. I learned about evidence, about justice. Real justice, not the kind you pretend to serve." The screen behind me filled with Maria's meticulous records, dates, locations, conversations. She'd risked everything to document the truth, waiting for someone who would listen. "Agent Torres found Maria 3 months ago," I continued. "The same week I received that anonymous email warning me about you. The pieces all connected. Your late nights, your unexplained wealth, the mysterious phone calls in Spanish you thought I couldn't understand." Jessica began to cry, genuine sobs that shook her shoulders. "The women who disappeared," she choked out. "You said they were relocated to safe houses. You promised they were being protected." "He promised a lot of things," Maria replied quietly. "To a lot of people. But the only promises he kept were to the criminals who paid him." The congregation had thinned somewhat. Several guests had already fled, not wanting to be associated with what was clearly becoming one of the biggest corruption scandals in state history. But many stayed, transfixed by the unfolding revelations. Marcus looked around wildly, seeing nothing but disgust and horror on the faces of his family, friends, and colleagues. His carefully cultivated image as a crusading prosecutor was dissolving, revealing the monster beneath. "You think these people's testimony will hold up?" he snarled, a desperate edge creeping into his voice. "Against a respected district attorney? Do you know how many judges owe me favors?" "Actually," Agent Torres interjected, "we're counting on you to tell us exactly which judges are compromised, unless you'd prefer we discover that through Maria's evidence as well." I turned to the laptop again, but Marcus's next words froze me in place. "Your brother," he said quietly, "for my ears only. Did you ever wonder why the drunk driver who killed him never faced charges?" My hands stilled over the keyboard. In the reflection on the screen, I saw something dark and vicious cross his face, the real Marcus Wheeler finally emerging from behind his polished mask. The cathedral fell silent as I processed Marcus's words. My mother's sharp intake of breath told me she'd heard him too. Thomas Anderson, my bright, funny, kind-hearted brother, had been killed by a drunk driver 2 years ago, 6 months, before I met Marcus. "What did you do?" I whispered, my fingers trembling over the keyboard. Marcus leaned closer, pitching his voice low. "Richard Kessler, the real estate developer who ran that red light. Ring any bells? His conviction would have cost the city millions in development contracts. So we came to an arrangement. The names clicked in my mind. Kessler Properties was one of the companies that had made payments to Wheeler Consulting. I'd seen the transactions but hadn't connected them to Tom's case. Display file TA7, I said to Agent Torres, my voice barely steady. The screen filled with new documents, police reports from my brother's case, correspondence between Marcus's office and Kessler Properties, and bank statements showing payments that coincided with the case being quietly dropped. My brother, I announced to the congregation, fury burning through my shock, was a third-grade teacher. He stayed late every Tuesday to help struggling students with their reading. 2 years ago, walking home from one of these sessions, he was struck by a drunk driver who ran a red light. My father stood up slowly, his judicial composure cracking, as he realized what was coming. The driver was Richard Kessler, CEO of Kessler Properties. There were witnesses. There was security camera footage. The responding officers found him still behind the wheel, well over the legal limit, an airtight case that mysteriously went nowhere. The screen showed a series of emails between Marcus and Kessler's lawyers discussing how to handle the situation. The timestamp on the first email was just hours after Tom's death. You were already working with Kessler, I said, turning to Marcus. The Port Authority development project, the new courthouse construction, millions in contracts that would have been jeopardized by a DUI manslaughter conviction. Julia Wheeler, still standing, covered her mouth in horror. That's why you insisted on handling the case personally. You said you wanted to make sure the family got justice. Justice had a price, Marcus replied, his mask completely gone now. One that Kessler was happy to pay, just business, Claire, nothing personal. Nothing personal? My laugh sounded foreign to my own ears. You started dating me 6 months after you helped my brother's killer walk free. Was that part of your business arrangement too? The implications hit the congregation like a physical wave. Marcus Wheeler hadn't just corrupted justice. He'd deliberately pursued a relationship with the sister of the man whose killer he'd protected. Did Kessler suggest it? I demanded, advancing on Marcus. Was I supposed to be insurance? Dating? The victim's sister, the perfect cover for any future investigations. You were convenient, he admitted, showing his true colors at last. A grieving family, desperate for justice. Your father's reputation as an incorruptible judge. Your mother's social connections. Dating you made the case disappear completely. Who would suspect the prosecutor dating the victim's sister? The cathedral erupted in horrified murmurs. Even Jessica, who'd known about many of Marcus's schemes, looked sickened by this revelation. Agent Torres, I said, not taking my eyes off Marcus. I believe Richard Kessler is still in the city. His office address and current location have been sent to your team. Torres nodded to several agents, who immediately headed for the doors. Mr. Kessler will be very interested in cooperating once he learns what evidence we have. Evidence? Marcus laughed bitterly. From where? The case files were destroyed. The witnesses were paid off. The security footage vanished. I turned back to the laptop, pulling up one final folder labeled Tom. My brother taught me something important before he died, I said quietly. He always told his students, keep a copy of everything. Guess what Tom did the night he filmed Kessler running that red light with his phone? The video began playing on the church's screen, shaky footage from a phone camera showing the intersection where my brother died. Tom had been documenting the broken traffic signal for his neighborhood safety blog. Instead, he captured his own murder. The timestamp showed 9:47 p.m. A black SUV blew through the red light at high speed, swerving erratically. The camera jerked, went dark, then stabilized, apparently falling from Tom's hand but continuing to record. Voices became audible, Kessler's slurred protests, witnesses calling 911, the eventual arrival of police sirens. Tom's phone was never found at the scene, I said, my voice tight. because Officer Reed here removed it before evidence processing. But Tom, ever the careful teacher, had enabled automatic cloud backup. Everything uploaded instantly. Reed slumped in his seat as 2 FBI agents moved to flank him. The missing footage was just the beginning, I continued, advancing through files. Tom's cloud drive contained years of documentation about traffic violations and construction code breaches at Kessler's properties. He'd been building a case for his community safety blog. More documents filled the screen. Tom's meticulous notes about payoffs to city officials, unsafe building practices, and zoning violations, all connecting back to Kessler properties, and by extension, to Marcus's office. My brother, I said, addressing the stunned congregation, was killed not just because Kessler was drunk, but because he recognized Kessler from his investigation. The traffic violation was convenient, but he had to die because of what he knew. My mother sobbed openly now, my father holding her while his own tears fell silently. The weight of understanding that their son's death had been more than a tragic accident crashed over them in waves. Claire, Marcus tried again, his voice adopting that persuasive tone he used on juries. You don't understand the complexities. I understand perfectly, I cut him off. I understand why you volunteered to handle Tom's case personally, why you spent months getting close to our family, why you made sure to be seen visiting his grave with me. The screen showed surveillance photos, Marcus and me at the cemetery, his perfectly crafted expressions of sympathy captured for posterity, photos he'd leaked to local papers to reinforce his image as a caring prosecutor. Each graveside visit coincided with a payment from Kessler, I noted, displaying the bank records. Was that intentional? Did you charge extra for exploiting my grief? Jessica stood up suddenly, swaying slightly. The engagement ring, she said, her voice hollow. The one you said was your grandmother's. It was purchased with Kessler's money, wasn't it? I pulled up the receipt, a 5-carat diamond ring, bought with funds traced directly back to Kessler Properties. My brother's blood money on my finger, I confirmed, ripping the ring off and letting it fall to the cathedral floor with a metallic ping. A down payment on my silence, though I didn't know it then. Agent Torres stepped forward again. Mr. Wheeler, given these new revelations, I should inform you that we're adding conspiracy to commit murder to your charges. Marcus's composure finally shattered completely. He spun toward David, his best man. You knew, he snarled. You helped arrange the evidence cleanup. If I'm going down for Tom Anderson's murder, you're coming with me. David backed away, hands raised. I just made some photos disappear, man. I didn't know it was a murder cover-up. You said it was a simple DUI fix. There's nothing simple about any of this, Torres interjected. Mr. Peterson, I suggest you and Officer Reed both consider the benefits of immediate cooperation. I turned back to the laptop, my hands steady now despite the emotional storm inside. But we're not finished yet, I announced. Tom's cloud drive contained something else. Evidence of a much larger conspiracy involving Kessler Properties, the Port Authority, and a series of mysterious deaths at construction sites. The screen filled with newspaper clippings spanning 5 years. Construction worker dies in freak accident. Immigrant laborer falls to death. Third fatal accident at Kessler site ruled accidental. 12 deaths in total, each officially classified as a workplace accident. My brother noticed the pattern, I explained, clicking through Tom's meticulously organized files. All immigrant workers, all working under false documentation, all dying shortly after raising concerns about site safety or payroll irregularities. Marcus's father, the retired police chief, had gone completely gray. As head of the precinct, during most of these incidents, he'd signed off on the accident classifications. Chief Wheeler, I said, addressing him directly, your son assured you these cases were thoroughly investigated, that the families received generous settlements in exchange for not pursuing legal action, but the settlements never existed. Screen showed bank records again. Money trails leading from Kessler Properties through Wheeler Consulting. then disappearing into offshore accounts. The workers' families hadn't received a penny. The workers weren't accidents, Agent Torres added. Stepping forward, they were loose ends. People who might expose the larger operation. The same operation connected to the human trafficking case. Understanding dawned on several faces in the congregation. The trafficked women in shipping containers, the undocumented, workers at construction sites, the mysterious deaths, all part of a single massive criminal enterprise. Your development projects, I said to Marcus, needed cheap labor. The trafficking ring provided workers. When those workers became problems, they had accidents. A perfect cycle of exploitation and murder. Julia Wheeler stumbled to the nearest pew, her Port Authority credentials suddenly feeling like a weight around her neck. The containers, she whispered. The ones that were expedited through customs. They weren't just bringing in women for the clubs. They were bringing in workers. For Kessler's sites, I confirmed. Tom figured it out. That's why he was really killed. The drunk driving incident just provided convenient cover. The cathedral doors opened again as more federal agents entered, escorting a handcuffed Richard Kessler. The real estate magnate's usual swagger was gone, replaced by the defeated look of a man who knew his empire was crumbling. Mr. Kessler has been very cooperative, Torres announced, particularly after learning about Tom Anderson's cloud drive. He's eager to discuss the full scope of his arrangement with Mr. Wheeler. Marcus lunged at Kessler, his composure completely shattered. You promised this would never come back on us, he shouted as agents restrained him. We had a deal. Deals require trust, Marcus, Kessler replied coldly. Like trusting you to properly dispose of evidence, to tie up loose ends, to not date the victim's sister and risk everything because you couldn't resist playing with fire. Jessica let out a choked laugh. That's why you pushed for a big wedding. All these people, all these witnesses. You wanted public proof of your relationship with the Anderson family. Ironclad evidence that you couldn't possibly be involved in Tom's death. The ultimate alibi, I agreed. The grieving sister's devoted fiancé. Even if Tom's evidence ever surfaced, who would believe the prosecutor who married the victim's sister was involved in his murder? Officer Reed suddenly stood up, his face ashen. I want to make a deal, he announced. I know where the original phone is. And I know about the other evidence Marcus had me remove from crime scenes. Marcus's best man, David, quickly followed suit. I have copies of everything, he blurted. Every conversation, every payoff, every cover-up. It was my insurance policy. But now I just want to save myself. One by one, Marcus's conspirators broke ranks, each rushing to save themselves as the full weight of their crimes became clear. The man who had orchestrated so many betrayals was finally experiencing betrayal himself. It's funny, I said, watching Marcus's world implode. How quickly a house of cards falls when you remove the right support. Speaking of support, I turned back to the laptop. Should we discuss the judge you were blackmailing? The one who signed off on all those sealed warrants? The laptop display shifted to a familiar face, Judge Michael Crawford, whose signature appeared on virtually every warrant and order in Marcus's major cases. The image showed him leaving an upscale hotel with a young woman, followed by bank statements, showing regular payments to an escort service. Judge Crawford had a weakness, I explained, my voice carrying through the now hushed cathedral, one that Marcus discovered and exploited. But he wasn't just blackmailing the judge with evidence of infidelity. More documents appeared, offshore accounts, property deeds, and transactions linking Crawford to a series of shell companies connected to both Wheeler Consulting and Kessler Properties. The judge wasn't just signing warrants, Agent Torres added. He was actively participating in the real estate fraud. Each property condemned by his court orders was later acquired by Kessler at a fraction of its value. Marcus's law school mentor, Professor Hamilton, stood up from his pew, his academic dignity crumbling. The thesis you wrote, he said shakily, About using judicial discretion to facilitate urban development. You were already planning this in law school? He learned from the best, Jessica interjected bitterly. Remember those private mentoring sessions, Professor? The ones where you taught him how to identify vulnerable judges? How to create leverage? The professor sank back into his seat as several heads turned his way. The corruption, it seemed, had roots reaching back to Marcus's earliest legal training. Judge Crawford isn't here today, I continued, because he's already in custody. He began cooperating yesterday after learning about this evidence. But he's not the only compromised judge, is he, Marcus? The screen displayed a spreadsheet. Names, dates, pressure points, payoff amounts. A systematic catalog of judicial corruption spanning 3 counties. 7 judges, I announced. Each carefully chosen, each compromised through different weaknesses. Gambling debts, affairs, hidden addictions, family secrets, a perfect network of controlled judicial power. My father, himself a retired judge, stood up again. The Anderson case last month, he said, his voice thick with disgust. The one where the evidence was clearly planted. Crawford signed those warrants too, didn't he? And helped select the jury, I confirmed. An innocent man is serving life because he refused to sell his property to Kessler Development. The jury never saw the real evidence, only what Marcus and Crawford allowed them to see. The cathedral's ancient heating system groaned, a mechanical counterpoint to the gasps and murmurs of the assembled guests. The scope of the corruption was staggering, an entire judicial system secretly puppet-mastered by Marcus and his conspirators. Each judge had a handler, I explained, clicking through more evidence. Someone to manage the payoffs, deliver the threats, ensure compliance. Would anyone like to guess who handled Judge Crawford? All eyes turned to David, still standing awkwardly, by the altar. His role as best man had been no accident. He was Marcus's most trusted lieutenant in the judicial corruption scheme. I recorded everything, David blurted out, clearly sensing which way the wind was blowing. Every meeting, every threat, every payoff. Marcus made me handle the judges because my father was on the Judicial Ethics Committee. The perfect cover. Marcus lunged at David again, restraint forgotten. You spineless! 2 FBI agents intercepted him before he could reach his former friend. The recordings are in a safe deposit box, David continued desperately. Everything you need to overturn every tainted conviction. I'll tell you where. We already have them, Agent Torres interrupted, along with your detailed notes about which cases were fixed, which verdicts were bought, and which witnesses were silenced. Very thorough work, Mr. Peterson. A young man stood up from the back pews. Stephen Anderson, no relation to me, recently convicted of a murder Marcus had prosecuted. Does this mean my conviction will be overturned? Every case involving these judges is being reviewed, Torres confirmed. Every warrant, every ruling, every verdict. The damage to our justice system, he paused, looking directly at Marcus, is unprecedented. I turned back to the laptop, my finger hovering over the keyboard. But judicial corruption was just one piece of the puzzle. Should we discuss the election fraud next? The campaign contributions that disappeared into offshore accounts? The voter suppression scheme you coordinated with Judge Crawford's wife? The screen filled with campaign finance reports, each doctored to hide a complex web of illegal contributions and voter manipulation. At the center of it all was Eleanor Crawford, the judge's wife and head of the county election board. Last year's judicial elections were particularly interesting, I said, pulling up a series of emails. 3 new judges appointed to the circuit court, all of them connected to Marcus's network before they even took office. The emails detailed an elaborate scheme, targeted voter suppression in key districts, manipulated voting machine maintenance schedules, and strategically timed technical difficulties at specific polling locations. Eleanor Crawford didn't just oversee the election, Agent Torres added. She orchestrated a systematic effort to ensure only compromised candidates reached the bench, candidates who were already under Marcus's control. A state senator stood up from his seat near the back, his face ashen. "The redistricting committee," he said. "The new maps that were approved last month. They weren't just about political advantage, were they?" "No, Senator Phillips," I confirmed. "The districts were redrawn to ensure friendly judges would handle cases in areas where Kessler planned future developments. A perfect system, controlled judges, suppressed voters, and guaranteed outcomes." The screen showed more evidence. Shell companies making campaign contributions just under the reporting threshold, each traceable back to Wheeler Consulting or Kessler. Properties. Marcus's political advisor, Sandra Chen, suddenly spoke up from her seat in the middle pews. "The campaign training sessions," she said, her voice shaking. "The ones where we taught judicial candidates how to navigate ethical guidelines. That was actually training them how to accept bribes without getting caught," I finished. "Yes, Ms. Chen, we have video of every session. Would you like to explain your role in those trainings now, or wait for your federal indictment?" Sandra's legal pad dropped from nerveless fingers. On it, I could see she'd been documenting every revelation, probably already planning her own defense strategy. "The voter suppression wasn't limited to judicial elections," I continued, advancing through more files. "Remember the homeless shelter closure last winter? The one that displaced hundreds of registered voters just before the district attorney election? Marcus had run unopposed in that election, his potential competitors all mysteriously dropping out after various scandals emerged. Scandals, the evidence showed, that had been carefully manufactured. 15 potential candidates, I noted, displaying their names. Each one systematically destroyed by fabricated evidence, false accusations, or financial pressure. All to ensure Marcus maintained his position of power. The cathedral's stained glass windows cast colored shadows across the evidence on screen, a grotesque rainbow highlighting the corruption of our democratic process. But the real masterpiece, I said, pulling up a new document, was the manipulation of jury pools. Eleanor Crawford didn't just control election boards, she had access to jury selection databases. For 7 years, she's been ensuring that key cases got jury pools stacked with people vulnerable to pressure or manipulation. Several former jurors were present in the congregation, having served on high-profile cases Marcus had prosecuted. Their faces showed dawning horror as they realized how they'd been chosen and exploited. "Your mother's gambling debts," I said to one. "Your brother's undocumented status," to another. "Your daughter's sealed juvenile record," to a third. Each of you was chosen because you had secrets that made you controllable. Marcus, still restrained by FBI agents, actually smiled. "Prove it," he challenged. "Prove any of this without exposing your own criminal actions in investigating private citizens." "Actually," Agent Torres interjected, "Mrs. Crawford provided all the proof we need. She's been documenting everything as her own insurance policy. 20 years of election fraud, jury tampering, and judicial manipulation, all meticulously detailed." Eleanor Crawford, it turned out, had learned from her husband's mistake of being vulnerable to blackmail. She'd ensured she could never be silenced by keeping records of every corrupt act she'd facilitated. "But we haven't even touched on the most recent election fraud," I said, turning back to the laptop. "The one involving the state Supreme Court vacancy. Would you like to explain why $3 million in cryptocurrency was transferred to an account in the Cayman Islands 2 days before Justice Reynolds suddenly retired?" The laptop displayed cryptocurrency transactions, each bouncing through dozens of digital wallets before reaching their destination. Justice Reynolds's abrupt retirement had shocked the legal community 3 months ago. Now, the reason became clear. $3 million, I said, tracing the money's path on screen, routed through 37 different wallets before landing in an account controlled by the justice's son. 2 days later, Reynolds announced his retirement, citing health concerns. Marcus's law school classmate, now a prominent defense attorney, stood up. "The Graham case," he said. "It was headed to the state Supreme Court. A class action against Kessler Properties that would have exposed everything, I confirmed. The trafficking, the deaths, the property fraud, all of it would have come out in discovery. Unless, of course, a friendly justice was in place to deny the appeal. The screen showed more documents. A list of potential Supreme Court nominees, each one annotated with possible pressure points and control mechanisms. Marcus had been planning this manipulation of the state's highest court for years. The governor's shortlist for Reynolds' replacement, I continued, included 3 names. All judges Marcus had already compromised, all guaranteed to protect his interests on the Supreme Court. Justice Reynolds' daughter-in-law, a junior associate at a prestigious law firm, burst into tears. "The house in Aspen," she sobbed. "The one David helped us buy." "It wasn't just a good real estate deal, was it?" "It was payment," David confirmed, his own voice hollow. "Part of a larger package to ensure the justice retired before the Graham case reached the court." Marcus had everything planned down to the timing of the retirement announcement. Marcus began to laugh, a high, unhinged sound that echoed through the cathedral's vaulted ceiling. "You all acted so shocked," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "As if every person in this room hasn't benefited from my corruption at some point. The contracts, the favors, the convenient legal outcomes. None of you questioned it when it served your interests." His words hit home. Throughout the congregation, faces flushed with guilt as people recalled the times they'd accepted Marcus's help without questioning its source. But the Supreme Court manipulation wasn't just about the Graham case, I pressed on, pulling up more evidence. It was about ensuring long-term control over the entire state judicial system. Every appeal, every constitutional challenge, every major legal decision, all potentially subject to Marcus's influence. Agent Torres stepped forward again. "We've identified 47 cases that would have come before the compromised court. Cases involving everything from environmental regulations to workers' rights to civil liberties." The scope of Marcus's ambition was staggering. He hadn't just corrupted the system. He'd aimed to reshape it entirely, bending the state's highest court to serve his network's interests. "Your own Supreme Court aspirations," I said to Marcus, "were part of the long-term plan, weren't they? First control the court through others, then take a seat yourself. The perfect position to protect your criminal empire." "Empire?" Marcus sneered, his facade completely shattered. "I built a system that worked, that got things done. Do you think anything in this state functions without some form of compromise? Without deals and arrangements and mutual understanding?" "You built a criminal conspiracy that destroyed lives," I corrected. "That perverted justice, corrupted democracy, and protected murderers." The screen showed faces. Tom, the construction workers, the trafficking victims, the wrongly convicted, a gallery of lives destroyed by Marcus's system. "But here's what you never understood," I continued, pulling up one final document. "True justice doesn't need corruption to function. It doesn't need secret deals or blackmail or blood money. And thanks to Sarah's digital forensics work, we found something interesting in your cryptocurrency transactions." Marcus's sneer faltered as he recognized the transaction pattern on screen. "That's not possible," he whispered. "Those records were supposed to be completely untraceable," I finished. "They would have been, except for one small detail you overlooked. Would you like to explain to everyone why you've been making regular payments to a certain Russian cryptocurrency wallet, the one belonging to—" The screen displayed a series of transactions to a wallet belonging to Viktor Petrov, a name that caused several federal agents to straighten in recognition. Cryptocurrency transfers spanning years, each carefully disguised, but now laid bare. Viktor Petrov, Agent Torres announced, is a person of significant interest to multiple federal agencies. His organization specializes in making evidence disappear permanently. Marcus's smug expression cracked completely. For the first time, real fear showed in his eyes. "Your regular payments to Petrov began 6 years ago," I continued, tracking. The timeline. Right after the first trafficking victims were discovered at the port. But you weren't just paying him to eliminate evidence, were you? The laptop showed more transfers, larger sums moving through even more complex paths. Each payment coincided with a mysterious death or disappearance connected to Marcus's cases. 15 witnesses, I said quietly. 15 people who could have exposed your operation. All of them disappeared after Petrov's organization received payment, including Elena Martinez, the janitor who saw you meeting with Kessler the night before my brother's death. Jessica collapsed into her seat, her face gray. The cleaning woman. You said she'd been deported. You said her family was taken care of. She was taken care of, I confirmed grimly, along with anyone else who threatened to expose the truth. Petrov's organization was your cleanup crew, wasn't they, Marcus? Your guarantee that no loose ends would ever unravel your perfect system. But Petrov had made a mistake. His organization's methodology was distinctive enough that it had drawn the attention of international law enforcement. Each disappearance added another piece to a pattern that ultimately led back to Marcus. The FBI wasn't the only agency investigating you, I revealed. Interpol has been tracking Petrov's connection to judicial corruption across 3 countries. You were just one piece of a much larger investigation. Agent Torres nodded to a distinguished-looking man in the back, who stood and displayed his Interpol credentials. Mr. Wheeler's activities caught our attention when similar patterns of judicial corruption emerged in cases connected to international trafficking networks. Marcus began to laugh again, but this time there was an edge of hysteria to it. You have no idea what you've done, he said. Petrov doesn't just disappear witnesses. He protects his clients. Permanently. Actually, I replied, pulling up another document. Petrov was arrested in Geneva 3 hours ago. His servers have been seized, his accounts frozen, his entire network exposed. Your protection is gone, Marcus. The screen showed a news feed, coordinated raids across Europe and Asia, Petrov's organization being dismantled in real time. Marcus's last line of defense was crumbling before his eyes. Did you really think I'd confront you without ensuring every angle was covered? I asked. That I'd risk leaving any part of your network intact? Petrov's arrest wasn't just about you. It was about dismantling an entire international criminal infrastructure. The Interpol agent stepped forward. We've been building this case for years. Ms. Anderson's evidence provided the final connections we needed. Mr. Wheeler's cooperation, willing or not, will be noted in multiple jurisdictions. Marcus's face contorted with rage and desperation. You stupid bitch, he snarled, lunging forward despite his restraints. Do you know what you've done? The people involved, the power structures you've threatened? I know exactly what I've done, I replied calmly. I've exposed every level of your operation, from local judges to international crime syndicates. Every person you've corrupted, every life you've destroyed, every deal you've made, it's all coming to light. The screen continued to update with news of arrests and raids across the globe. Marcus's corruption had tentacles reaching far beyond our state, connecting to criminal enterprises that were now falling like dominoes. But we're still not finished, I said, turning back to the laptop. There's one more piece to this puzzle. One final revelation that explains why you were so desperate to maintain control of the Supreme Court. Should we discuss the offshore accounts connected to certain federal intelligence agencies? The laptop screen displayed a series of classified documents, each bearing Federal Intelligence Agency watermarks. Marcus went completely still, while several FBI agents exchanged concerned glances. These files, I said, detail something called Operation Shadow Court, a domestic surveillance program using compromised judges to authorize unofficial wiretaps and searches. Ring any bells, Marcus? Agent Torres stepped forward, his expression grave. This moves beyond FBI jurisdiction. I'll need to contact. It's already been handled, the Interpol agent interrupted. Multiple intelligence agencies are currently conducting internal investigations. Mr. Wheeler's cooperation has been requested at the highest levels. Marcus's face had gone from pale to ashen. Those files were encrypted. Level 10 security. Protocols. There's no way. Unless someone had inside help, I finished. Someone like Janet Myers, your former colleague from the intelligence community. The one who sent me that anonymous email 3 months ago. The pieces were finally falling into place for the stunned congregation. Marcus hadn't just been a corrupt prosecutor. He'd been an intelligence asset gone rogue, using classified operations for personal gain. Janet reached out after discovering your side operations, I explained. She couldn't expose you officially without compromising ongoing intelligence operations, but she could point me in the right direction, knowing I had personal motivation to dig deeper. The screen showed more documents. Authorized surveillance operations twisted to serve Marcus's criminal network, classified intelligence used to blackmail, judges and officials, national security apparatus repurposed for private gain. You didn't just corrupt the justice system, I said. You corrupted national security operations, used classified resources to build your criminal empire. Every unauthorized surveillance, every compromised operation, it's all documented. Marcus lunged forward with sudden violence, breaking free from the startled FBI agents. But instead of attacking me, he ran for the cathedral's side door. He made it 3 steps before being tackled by David, of all people. One final betrayal from his former right-hand man. I was wondering when you'd run, I said as agents restrained him again. The same way you ran from the intelligence agency when they first suspected you. The same way you've run from every consequence, leaving others to suffer while you escaped clean. My father stood up, his judicial demeanor warring with paternal pride. Claire, he said softly, you didn't just expose corruption. You've dismantled an entire shadow system of justice. No, Marcus spat, struggling against his restraints. I created order, a system that worked. Without me, without people willing to do what's necessary, everything falls apart. Wrong, I replied. You created chaos disguised as order, corruption disguised as justice, murder disguised as accident. But disguises eventually fail. Masks eventually fall. I turned to the congregation, to the witnesses of this unmasking. Every case will be reviewed, every conviction re-examined, every victim given a chance at real justice. It won't be quick and it won't be easy, but it will be. Right. The cathedral's ancient bell began to toll noon, its deep resonance adding gravity to the moment. Marcus Wheeler, prosecutor, criminal, murderer, slumped in defeat as federal agents led him away. Jessica approached me, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, she whispered. About your brother, about everything. Save it for your testimony, I replied. The truth is, the only apology that matters now. As the agents and witnesses filed out, I walked to my brother's favorite pew. Tom had always sat here during Sunday services, saying the morning light through the stained glass helped him think clearly. It's done, Tom, I whispered, touching the polished wood. The truth is out. All of it. My mother and father joined me, their arms encircling me in a family embrace we hadn't shared since Tom's death. Through the stained glass windows, camera. Flashes sparkled as the media documented Marcus's perp walk down the cathedral steps. Claire, Agent Torres called from the doorway. We'll need your formal statement. I nodded, standing straight. My wedding dress, now a symbol of justice rather than deception, rustled as I walked toward the future I had helped create. A future where truth, no matter how long buried, would finally see the light of day. The cathedral doors closed behind me with a resonant thud, bringing an end to both a wedding and an era of corruption. But it wasn't an ending. Not really. It was a beginning. The beginning of real justice.